My roommate sold my antidepressants as party pills, so I destroyed her entire nursing career. My roommate Kelly knew I needed antidepressants to survive. She was in nursing school, always talking about helping people heal. She was stealing them to sell at frat parties. Started small, missing 2 or 3 pills. Thought I was miscounting. Depression brain fog, right? Then came withdrawals, brain zaps, crying spells, panic attacks like heart attacks. Doctor increased my dose, worried I'd built tolerance. Kelly was so supportive, offered to pick up prescriptions since pharmacy was near her clinical site. Held my hand during withdrawals. Thursday night. Kelly thought I was at my boyfriend's. Came home early with migraine. Heard her on phone. Yeah, have like 30. The good ones, Wellbutrin. People crush them for the high. $20 each. Party at Sigma Chai? Perfect. Recorded everything on my phone, shaking. Basically medical grade speed. My depressed roommate won't notice. Girl cries so much she doesn't know what's real. Then, not like she actually needs them. Depression is just excuse to be lazy. When I'm a nurse, I'm not wasting time on attention seekers. A future nurse. Access to vulnerable patients. Someone who took oath to do no harm. Didn't confront her. Did something worse. Installed hidden camera in common area. Marked my pills with UV dots visible under blacklight. Documented everything. Every missing pill. Every withdrawal symptom. Every ER visit. $3,000 in medical bills. 2 weeks later. Kelly threw graduation prep party thinking I was at work. Called in sick, parked down street. Watched through camera app as she entered my room. Took entire bottle. 90 pills. On camera, dumped them into baggies, sorted like candy. Psychiatric trick-or-treating, she joked. Her nursing school friends were there. Future healthcare workers laughing as she explained which medications were worth stealing from patients. Kelly's fatal mistake. One buyer was 19-year-old she told was totally safe with alcohol. That kid, the dean's daughter, ended up in ER that night. I compiled everything. Videos, recordings, marked pills, hospital-confirmed UV dots. Medical records showing correlation between missing meds and ER visits. Texts of her offering to help with prescriptions. Venmo screenshots with pill emojis. Sent it all. Nursing school. State Board of Nursing. Every clinical site. DEA. Detective investigating dean's daughter's overdose. Dominoes fell fast. Expelled 2 months before graduation. Board banned her permanently from licensure, flagged nationally. Arrested. Multiple felonies. Drug distribution. Theft of prescribed medication. Reckless endangerment. 3 nursing friends who bought from her also expelled. She'd taken $80,000 in loans for degrees she'll never use. Mugshot went viral in City's Crime Watch. Every hospital within 200 miles knows her face. She tried suing me for ruining her life and invasion of privacy. Judge laughed seeing evidence. She got 18 months prison, owes me $15,000 damages. Her mother called crying. You destroyed her future over some pills. Your daughter destroyed her future when she decided my life was worth less than party money. Kelly's in prison cafeteria now. Closest she'll get to healthcare is serving Jell-O. New roommate is elderly lady who bakes cookies. Thinks my antidepressants are vitamins. But still check my pill count. Trust is funny. Once someone sells your sanity for beer money, you never heal quite the same. Those Sigma Chi boys? Chapter no longer exists. University takes drug distribution seriously with video evidence. Dean's daughter survived, testified at trial. Found out Kelly had been stealing from other students. Had notebook with different meds and street values. But yesterday, everything changed. Got call from FBI agent who handled interstate selling case. Kelly's been talking. Making deal for reduced sentence. About what? Says she wasn't working alone. Someone in hospital was supplying her with samples, teaching her what to steal. Blood went cold. Who? She won't say yet, but claims they're still active. Still working, still accessing patient medications. That's impossible. Everyone involved was caught. Were they? Check your email. Opened attachment. Security footage from hospital where Kelly did clinicals. Timestamp from last week. Someone in scrubs at medication cart. Pocketing pills, face partially visible. I recognize them. That's Dr. Huffman, my psychiatrist. The one who increased my dose when I had withdrawals. Who never questioned why I needed more. Who had access to my medical records showing exactly which medications I was on. We need your help, agent said. Kelly's deal depends on giving us the whole network. But she'll only talk to you. Why me? Says you're the only one who really understood what she was doing. Says there's something about your pills specifically. Something special about your prescription. What do you mean special? She keeps saying check the real pills, the ones she never got. Says you'll understand. Looked at my current bottle. Same medication, same dose. But manufacturer label was different. Grabbed UV light from when I marked pills before. Shined it on current medication. Every single pill glowed. But not with my marks. With something already printed on them. Tiny numbers, serial codes. My psychiatrist had been giving me tracked pills. Like a clinical trial. But I was never in a clinical trial. Phone rang. Dr. Huffman. Hello, I noticed you missed your appointment today. We need to discuss your medication, in person, tonight. I hit the red button before I could think twice about it. The phone bounced off the carpet and landed face down near the couch leg. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Meeting him alone would be the dumbest thing I could possibly do right now. He knew I found something. He knew I was onto him. My brain kept screaming at me to run, to hide, to do anything except walk into that office tonight. I grabbed my phone off the floor and pulled up the FBI agent's number with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. 30 seconds. That's all it took before I was calling him back. The phone rang twice before he picked up. I told him about Huffman's call, about the urgent meeting tonight, about how his voice sounded wrong, too calm, like he was reading from a script. Agent Castaneda went quiet on the other end. I could hear him breathing, could almost feel him thinking through the phone. Then he asked if I was somewhere safe right now. I looked around my apartment, the windows with their cheap blinds, the door with its single lock, the elderly roommate who thought my pills were vitamins. Safe felt like a word from another language. 2 agents showed up at my door 20 minutes later. They swept through my apartment like they were looking for bombs, checking closets and under furniture and behind curtains. I sat on my couch trying to remember how to breathe normally. They found nothing, but one agent stayed posted outside my door anyway. The other one, a woman with gray hair and kind eyes, sat down across from me and explained what happens next. Her voice was steady and professional, the kind of voice that probably talked people off ledges. I barely heard half of what she said. My brain kept replaying Huffman's words. We need to discuss your medication, in person, tonight. Agent Castaneda showed up himself an hour later. He wanted me to wear a wire to the meeting, but he needed my consent because it was dangerous. He said those words slowly, like he wanted to make sure I understood. Dangerous. Huffman calling me directly meant he was worried about what I knew. Worried people did stupid things. Worried people might try to control the situation in ways that could hurt me. But worried people also talked too much, said things they shouldn't say, admitted to things they thought were still secret. If I wore the wire, if I went into that office and asked the right questions, Huffman might incriminate himself trying to explain everything away. I spent 2 hours at the FBI field office learning how the wire worked. They showed me the tiny recording device, smaller than a matchbox, and explained where it would sit under my shirt. They taught me what to say to get Huffman talking. Stay calm. Ask open questions. Let silence do the work. People hate silence. They fill it with explanations and justifications and confessions they never meant to make. A woman with short red hair played Huffman while I practiced. She pretended to be concerned and caring, and I practiced asking why my pills looked different. Why they had codes on them. Why he never told me I was part of a study. My voice shook the first 10 times. By the 20th, it almost sounded normal. Agent Castaneda sat down with me after the practice session ended. He explained that Kelly identified Huffman as her pharmaceutical company contact. She gave them his name, his office location, even some text messages about which medications were worth stealing. But text messages weren't enough. They needed recorded evidence of him admitting to the illegal trial. My medication bottles with their UV codes were circumstantial evidence, proof that something weird was happening, but not proof of what or why. Huffman's own words would be solid proof. The kind of proof that held up in court, the kind that put people in prison. I agreed to do it. Not because I was brave, not because I wanted to help the FBI. I agreed because I kept thinking about all the other patients who might be taking tracked pills right now without knowing. Patients who trusted their doctors like I trusted Huffman. Patients who thought their side effects were just part of being sick, not part of being someone's science project. If Huffman did this to me, he probably did it to dozens of other people, maybe hundreds. People who were already vulnerable, already struggling, already barely holding on. People whose doctors were supposed to help them, not use them. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at my ceiling and replaying every appointment I ever had with Huffman. The way he always seemed so caring and thorough, the detailed questions about my symptoms and side effects, how he always wrote everything down in his little notebook, nodding and humming like he really cared. I thought he was being a good doctor. Now I realized he was collecting data. Every question had a purpose. Every symptom I reported went into some database somewhere. Every dose increase was probably planned weeks in advance, part of some protocol I never agreed to. I felt sick thinking about it. Sick and angry and scared all at once. The next morning, FBI technicians wired me up in an unmarked van parked 2 blocks from Huffman's office. The recording device was smaller than I expected when they actually put it on me. It sat against my ribs under my shirt, held in place with medical tape that pulled at my skin. They assured me agents would be positioned nearby if anything went wrong. One across the street in a coffee shop. One in the building next door. One in a car at the end of the block. They could be inside Huffman's office in under 30 seconds if I said the safe word. The safe word was pineapple. I practiced saying it 3 times to make sure I could get it out if my throat closed up with fear. I walked into Huffman's office at exactly 6 p.m. like he asked. The waiting room was empty. The receptionist had gone home. Huffman stood in his doorway waiting for me, and he smiled that warm smile I used to find comforting. He gestured to my usual chair, the one by the window with the ugly brown cushion. I sat down and he closed the door behind us. The click of the lock made my stomach drop. Something in his eyes looked different now. Still friendly on the surface, still concerned and professional. But underneath there was something else. Something calculating. Something that was measuring me, figuring out what I knew and how much damage I could do. Huffman leaned back in his chair and smiled that warm smile I used to find comforting. He asked if I'd been experiencing any unusual symptoms lately, and something in his tone made my skin crawl. The question sounded casual, but his eyes were searching my face too carefully, like he was trying to read something specific there. I told him I'd been having trouble sleeping and feeling paranoid, which was completely true. My hands were shaking slightly and I pressed them against my thighs to hide it. He nodded slowly and made a note on his pad, the pen scratching across paper in the quiet office. I watched his face carefully while I talked, looking for any sign that he knew I'd discovered the UV codes on my pills. His expression stayed professional, but there was tension in his jaw that hadn't been there before. He set down his pen and suggested we review my medication history together, turning toward his computer. His back was to me now, and I could see his shoulders were tight. He started typing, and his hands were trembling slightly as they moved across the keyboard. The trembling was subtle, but it was there, a tiny shake that made the keys click unevenly. He talked while he typed, filling the silence with medical terms about serotonin levels and dosage adjustments. The words came faster than usual, tumbling over each other like he was nervous. I'd never heard him talk this fast before, and it made me more certain that he was scared. He pulled up my file and started scrolling through months of appointment notes. I could see the screen from my chair, pages of his careful documentation about my symptoms and reactions. He kept talking about neurotransmitters and therapeutic windows, using big medical words that would normally make me feel stupid. But now I realized he was hiding behind the jargon, using it as a shield to avoid saying anything real. I decided to push and see what would happen. I mentioned that I'd noticed something strange about my pills lately, that they looked different under certain lights. The typing stopped. Huffman's shoulders went rigid, and for a long moment he didn't move at all. Then he turned around slowly in his chair, his professional mask slipping just a little. His smile was still there, but it looked forced now, stretched too tight across his face. He asked what I meant by different, and I could hear the fake casualness in his voice. It reminded me of how Kelly used to sound when she was lying, that overly relaxed tone that actually meant she was panicking inside. I explained about the UV light and the serial codes, watching his face the whole time. I saw the exact moment he realized I knew. His eyes widened slightly and his smile disappeared completely. He looked at me like I'd just pulled out a weapon, like I'd become dangerous somehow. The air in the office felt heavy and wrong. Huffman was quiet for a long moment, just staring at me with this calculating expression. Then he stood up and walked to his office door. I heard the lock click and my stomach dropped. He came back and sat down in the chair across from me instead of behind his desk. The change in position felt threatening somehow, like he was trying to intimidate me by being closer. He said we needed to have a very honest conversation about my treatment. His tone had shifted completely from warm doctor to cold businessman. The caring psychiatrist act was gone, and what was left felt dangerous. He explained that I'd been selected for a special medication program because my case was particularly interesting. The pharmaceutical company wanted detailed data on how patients with my specific symptoms responded to different dosages. He made it sound like an honor, like I should be grateful for the attention. He said the medication was cutting edge, and I'd gotten access to treatment most people couldn't afford. I felt sick listening to him reframe what he'd done as some kind of favor. I asked if he'd ever planned to tell me I was in a trial. Huffman hesitated, and I watched him choose his words carefully. He said the research was observational, not experimental, so informed consent wasn't technically required. The way he said technically made it clear he knew exactly how wrong this was. He was hiding behind legal loopholes and medical definitions, trying to make it sound less bad than it actually was. But I'd been in his office for months talking about my symptoms and struggles, and he'd never once mentioned that my pills were being tracked. He'd never asked permission to collect data on me. He'd just done it because he could, because I was vulnerable and trusting and he had access. Huffman leaned forward and admitted that the pharmaceutical company compensated him for patient data. He said it quickly like he wanted to get past it, then immediately insisted the medication was safe and I was never in danger. I thought about my withdrawals when Kelly was stealing my pills. The brain zaps and panic attacks and ER visits that cost me $3,000. I thought about Huffman increasing my dose, acting concerned, when really he was probably following some protocol the pharmaceutical company had given him. The rage built in my chest like pressure, hot and tight. Huffman kept talking, saying we could work this out between us. He said involving authorities would only complicate things unnecessarily, make everything harder for both of us. He suggested he could cover my medical expenses and continue my treatment for free if I was willing to keep this private. He was trying to buy my silence right there in his office, offering me money to protect himself. The wire under my shirt felt suddenly obvious and I was terrified he'd notice it. I forced myself to stay calm and asked how many other patients he'd enrolled without their knowledge. Huffman deflected immediately, saying he couldn't discuss other patients due to confidentiality. But his eyes shifted away from mine when he said it, looking at the wall behind me instead of my face. I knew the number was high enough that he was scared. He'd done this to enough people that getting caught would destroy him completely. He started talking faster then, words coming out like he'd been holding them in for too long. Pharmaceutical trials cost millions of dollars, he explained, and the approval process takes years, sometimes decades. Sometimes researchers had to be creative to gather the data they needed. Sometimes the traditional methods didn't work for everyone. Sometimes people like me benefited from access to cutting-edge treatments we'd never get otherwise. He kept saying sometimes like it made everything okay, like repetition would turn wrong into right. My skin crawled listening to him reframe what he'd done as some kind of favor. The wire under my shirt felt hot against my ribs, and I wondered if he could see my heart beating through my clothes. He leaned back in his chair and said pharmaceutical companies needed real-world data, not just controlled trials with perfect subjects. People like me, with complicated symptoms and histories, we were valuable for research. He made it sound like I should feel special instead of violated. I forced myself to breathe normally and told him I needed time to think about his offer. Huffman's shoulders dropped and relief spread across his face like I'd just agreed to keep his secret. He stood up and walked me to the door, one hand on my shoulder like we were old friends. He reminded me I could call him anytime, day or night, if I wanted to discuss this further. His office number, his cell phone, even his home number if it was urgent. He squeezed my shoulder and said he knew I'd make the right choice, that I understood how important this research was for future patients. The door clicked shut behind me and I walked down the hallway trying not to run. The moment I stepped outside into the parking lot, 3 FBI agents moved in from different directions. Huffman was still locking his office door when they surrounded him. I watched from across the street next to Agent Castaneda's car as they put handcuffs on Huffman's wrists. He looked up and saw me standing there. His face changed from confused to understanding to complete betrayal in about 2 seconds. He stared at me like I was the one who'd done something wrong, like I'd violated his trust instead of the other way around. One of the agents put a hand on Huffman's head and guided him into the back of their car. I watched until they drove away, and then my legs started shaking so hard I had to sit down on the curb. Agent Castaneda crouched next to me and said I did great, that the recording was perfect. Huffman had admitted to conducting unauthorized human trials and accepting payment from pharmaceutical companies. Clear evidence of everything they needed. He helped me stand up and said they were executing search warrants on Huffman's office and home right now. They expected to find records of other patients, communications with pharmaceutical company representatives, maybe even protocols for the experimental trials. Other agents were already inside Huffman's office pulling files from cabinets and downloading data from his computer. Castaneda walked me to his car and said we needed to go back to the FBI office so I could give a formal statement while everything was fresh in my mind. The FBI office had fluorescent lights that made everything look washed out and tired. I sat in a small room with a camera in the corner and told my story to 3 different agents who all asked the same questions in slightly different ways. They wanted exact quotes from Huffman, specific details about when he increased my dose, any conversations about my symptoms that seemed unusual. After 2 hours, Castaneda came back in and said Kelly wanted to see me. She'd been asking for days, ever since they arrested her, and now that they had Huffman's confession on tape, they thought it might be useful for me to hear what she had to say. I asked why she wanted to see me specifically, and Castaneda said she claimed she had information I needed to know, things about my medication that went beyond what Huffman admitted. I agreed because I needed to understand the whole picture. 2 days later, I sat in a prison visiting room with gray walls and metal tables bolted to the floor. The guard said Kelly would be out in 5 minutes, and I wasn't sure what I was supposed to feel. Anger seemed too simple, and pity seemed too generous, and everything in between felt complicated and exhausting. I hadn't seen her since before her arrest, before everything exploded. The door buzzed and opened, and Kelly walked in wearing an orange jumpsuit that was too big for her. She looked smaller than I remembered, like prison had shrunk her somehow. Her nursing school confidence was completely gone, replaced by something that looked like shame mixed with fear. Kelly sat down across from me and started crying immediately. Tears ran down her face, and she said she was sorry, that she never understood how badly she hurt me until she ended up here. Her voice cracked, and she kept wiping her eyes with her sleeve. She said prison gave her time to think about what she'd done, about how she'd treated me like I wasn't even human. I didn't say anything because I didn't trust my voice to stay steady. She took a shaky breath and started explaining what really happened. A pharmaceutical rep approached her during her clinical rotation at the hospital. He offered her money for patient information and medication samples. At first, it was just data about prescribing patterns, which doctors wrote which prescriptions, nothing that seemed harmful. She thought she was helping with market research, but it got bigger fast. The rep started asking for specific information about individual patients, their symptoms, their responses to medications. Then he wanted actual pills, samples she could take from the medication carts when nurses weren't looking. Kelly said she needed the money for school and convinced herself it wasn't really hurting anyone. The rep introduced her to Huffman after a few months. Huffman was running unofficial trials and needed someone with access to patients, someone who could identify vulnerable people who wouldn't notice missing pills or connect their symptoms to the trials. Kelly's job was to find patients like that and report back about their conditions and medications. Huffman paid her $500 for each patient she recruited. She enrolled 7 people total before I caught her. She kept saying she didn't think of us as real people, just data points and money, and she knew how messed up that sounded now. But it was true. I asked if she knew the medication could hurt us, and Kelly nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. The pharmaceutical company was testing a modified formula that hadn't been approved yet. They were using psychiatric patients as test subjects because they figured our symptoms would hide any side effects. If we got worse, doctors would just think our depression or anxiety was getting worse naturally. Kelly said Huffman gave her specific instructions about which patients to target. People already on antidepressants and showing symptoms, people who were struggling enough that changes would seem normal. She admitted she targeted me specifically because I was already on antidepressants and having a hard time. I was the perfect cover for testing how patients responded when doses were suddenly increased or decreased without them knowing. The pharmaceutical company wanted data on medication manipulation, what happened when people missed doses or took extra doses, how their bodies and minds reacted to the changes. Kelly's voice got quieter, and she said they used me like a lab rat, and she helped them do it, because she wanted the money more than she cared about what happened to me. She told me the number like it didn't mean anything, $500 per person, 7 people total before everything fell apart. Kelly kept repeating that she didn't think of us as real people, just data points and money, and she knew how messed up that sounded now, but it was the truth. Her voice got even quieter when she said it, like saying it out loud made it more real. I sat there trying to process what 7 people meant, 7 lives she'd messed with for $3,500 total. That was it. That was what my sanity and 6 other people's mental health were worth to her. I asked if she knew the medication could actually hurt us, not just make us feel weird for a few days. Kelly nodded, and the tears came faster, streaming down her face and dripping onto the table between us. The pharmaceutical company was testing a modified formula that hadn't been approved yet, she said. They were using psychiatric patients as test subjects because they figured our symptoms would hide any bad reactions. If we got worse, doctors would just think our depression or anxiety was getting worse naturally, not that the pills were causing new problems. And nobody would connect the dots because mentally ill people always have ups and downs, right? That's what Huffman told her when he explained the whole setup. Kelly wiped her face with her sleeve and said Huffman gave her specific instructions about which patients to target. People already on medication and showing symptoms, people struggling enough that changes would seem normal. She admitted she picked me specifically because I was already on antidepressants and having a hard time. I was the perfect cover for testing how patients responded when doses were suddenly changed without them knowing. The company wanted data on what happened when people missed doses or took extra doses, how their bodies and minds reacted to the manipulation. Then she told me about another patient she recruited, a guy who was Phoebe's brother. She didn't say his name, just that he was young and dealing with anxiety. He ended up in the psychiatric ward after a severe reaction to the experimental formula they'd been testing on him. Kelly visited him once at the hospital, saw him strapped to a bed because he'd tried to hurt himself during a psychotic episode that the medication triggered. That was when she realized what she'd actually been part of, when she saw a real person suffering because of choices she'd made for money. She said that visit was what made her start talking to the FBI, made her realize she couldn't keep pretending this was just some harmless side hustle. I sat there trying to imagine Kelly walking into that psychiatric ward and seeing what her actions had caused, trying to figure out if I believed her remorse was real or just another performance. The Kelly I knew would have found a way to rationalize it, to make it someone else's fault, but this person sitting across from me seemed genuinely broken by what she'd done. Something shifted in my head while she was talking, some piece of the anger I'd been holding onto for months. I realized Kelly was a victim too, just in a different way than me. The pharmaceutical company and Huffman had seen her desperation for money and her complete lack of empathy training, and they'd turned her into an accomplice in their scheme. They'd used her the same way they used us, except she was supposed to be grateful for the opportunity to help them hurt people. She was young and broke and in over her head with student loans, and they'd offered her what seemed like easy money for simple tasks. They'd slowly pulled her deeper into the conspiracy, making each step seem reasonable until she was too involved to back out without destroying herself. That didn't excuse what she did to me, didn't make the withdrawals or the panic attacks or the medical bills disappear, but it made the whole thing more complicated than just her being evil. Kelly's voice changed when she started talking about the deal the FBI was offering her. She said they wanted her to testify against the pharmaceutical company executives who designed the whole program, the people who came up with Project Insight, and decided vulnerable patients were acceptable casualties for cheap research data. She'd already given them names, emails, and bank records showing systematic patient exploitation across multiple cities. The FBI had evidence of similar operations in 11 other states, all running the same basic scheme with different corrupt doctors and desperate medical students as recruiters. Kelly said the executives had built an entire system around exploiting people like us, people whose complaints wouldn't be taken seriously because we were already labeled as mentally unstable. She kept emphasizing how big this was, how many people had been hurt, like that somehow made her role in it less terrible. I asked what she wanted from me, why she'd asked the FBI to arrange this visit after everything that happened between us. Kelly looked right at me for the first time since she sat down and said she just needed me to know the whole truth. She wasn't asking for forgiveness because she knew she didn't deserve it, but she wanted me to understand that this was bigger than just her stealing my pills to sell at parties. She wanted me to know that Huffman and the pharmaceutical company had manipulated both of us, that we were both part of their experiment even though we played different roles. She said she'd live with the guilt forever, that knowing what she'd contributed to would never leave her, but at least she could help stop it from happening to anyone else. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know if I believed her or if I even cared about her guilt anymore. The person I'd hated for months was sitting across from me crying and broken, and all I felt was tired. Agent Castaneda was waiting for me when I left the prison, leaning against his car in the parking lot. He walked over as soon as he saw me and asked how it went, if Kelly had told me everything they'd discussed. I nodded and he gestured toward his car, saying we needed to talk about what came next. We sat in his car with the engine running for heat, and he explained that Kelly's testimony had blown open a massive case that went way beyond anything they'd initially suspected. The pharmaceutical company, something called Viridian Therapeutics, had been running unauthorized trials in 12 states using corrupt doctors and medical students as recruiters. They'd built an entire network of people willing to exploit vulnerable patients for money, and Kelly was just one small piece of a much larger operation. Castaneda said the FBI had been investigating Viridian for months on unrelated fraud charges, when Kelly's cooperation gave them the breakthrough they needed to understand the full scope of the patient exploitation scheme. He pulled out a folder from his briefcase and showed me documents with names and locations, maps with red pins marking cities where they'd identified operations similar to what Huffman and Kelly had been running. The FBI had identified over 200 potential victims so far, all psychiatric patients whose medications had been secretly switched to experimental formulas without their knowledge or consent. Castaneda said they needed me to be a witness because I had the clearest evidence trail of anyone they'd found so far. The UV-coded pills in my possession, the recorded confession from Huffman, the documented medical records showing the correlation between the medication changes and my symptoms. All of it together made an airtight case that could help bring down the entire operation. He said most victims didn't have that kind of documentation, that many of them didn't even realize yet that they'd been part of an illegal experiment. 3 days later, I was sitting in a lawyer's office downtown, waiting to meet someone named Caroline Brady who specialized in pharmaceutical litigation. Agent Castaneda had recommended her, said she'd handled cases against big drug companies before and won significant settlements for victims. Caroline walked in exactly on time, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a briefcase that looked expensive. She sat down across from me and got straight to business, explaining that beyond the criminal case the FBI was building, there was going to be a massive civil lawsuit against Viridian Therapeutics. She said victims could receive significant compensation for the medical harm and emotional trauma we'd experienced, that the company would be forced to pay for what they'd done to us. I asked how much money we were talking about, and she said it was too early to know for sure. But cases like this typically resulted in settlements ranging from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands per victim, depending on the severity of harm. Caroline opened her laptop and pulled up information about Viridian Therapeutics, showing me their corporate structure and financial reports. She explained that Viridian was a mid-sized pharmaceutical company that had been struggling financially for several years, watching bigger competitors dominate the market while their own drug development pipeline dried up. They'd seen unauthorized trials as a way to cut research costs dramatically, to gather the real-world data they needed for FDA applications, without spending millions on proper clinical trials with informed consent and safety oversight. Caroline said they'd specifically targeted vulnerable populations who were less likely to report problems or be believed if they did, psychiatric patients who could be dismissed as unreliable if they complained about side effects. The company had calculated that the risk of getting caught was worth the potential profit from getting their modified formulas approved faster and cheaper than their competitors. Over the next week, FBI agents in dark windbreakers surrounded Viridian Therapeutics headquarters at dawn. They carried boxes out for hours while news helicopters circled overhead. Agent Castaneda called me that afternoon with an update about what they found inside. The company had kept detailed records of everything, thousands of documents showing exactly how they tracked patients without consent. There were spreadsheets listing people by medication type, dosage changes, and observed side effects. Project Insight was the official name they used internally, like it was just another business operation instead of illegal human testing. The documents showed they deliberately chose psychiatric patients because they figured nobody would believe us if we complained. One memo from the chief medical officer actually said vulnerable populations provided the most cost-effective data collection because traditional trials required too much oversight. They had calculated the risk of getting caught versus the money they would save on proper research. Apparently, exploiting sick people were just a business decision to them. Agent Castaneda sent me some of the seized files, and reading them made me feel sick. My name appeared in multiple spreadsheets with notes about my withdrawal symptoms and ER visits. They had tracked everything Huffman reported back to them, turning my suffering into data points they could use for FDA applications. There were at least 200 other names in those files, people scattered across 12 states who had no idea their doctors were feeding information to a pharmaceutical company. The scope was so much bigger than I had imagined when I first discovered those UV codes on my pills. 3 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the other end said her name was Phoebe Tillman, and the FBI had given her my contact information. She asked if we could meet because she needed to talk to someone who understood what Viridian had done to us. I agreed immediately, and we set up a time to meet at a coffee shop near campus. 2 other victims reached out that same day through email addresses Agent Castaneda had shared with my permission. We all decided to meet together instead of separately. Walking into that coffee shop felt surreal. I spotted them right away at a corner table. 3 strangers who somehow felt connected to me through this nightmare. Phoebe was younger than I expected, maybe 23, with tired eyes that looked older than her face. The other 2 were college students like me, a guy named Caleb who kept fidgeting with his coffee cup, and a woman named Jen who seemed angry just sitting there. We spent 3 hours sharing our stories, and the patterns were impossible to ignore. Each of us had trusted our doctors completely. Each of us had experienced sudden changes in our medication that caused problems. Each of us had been told it was normal, that our bodies were just adjusting, that we needed to be patient. Viridian had found the perfect victims because we were already struggling with mental health, already doubting our own perceptions, already used to people not believing us when we said something was wrong. Phoebe's story hit me the hardest. She had been given a higher dose of the experimental formula than anyone else, and her body reacted badly. She ended up in the hospital with liver failure, and now at 23 years old, she has permanent damage that requires constant monitoring. The doctors told her she would need regular blood tests for the rest of her life to make sure her liver keeps functioning, all because Viridian wanted to test whether patients could handle increased dosages without proper safety protocols. They had literally poisoned her to collect data, and her life would never be the same. Caleb told us about his suicide attempt during a withdrawal period when his medication was secretly switched. He survived, but the trauma of that experience combined with learning it was deliberately caused has left him barely able to function. He dropped out of school and moved back home with his parents. He can't work because panic attacks hit him randomly throughout the day. His hands shook while he talked, and I recognized that shake from my own worst days. The guilt in his voice was obvious when he said he should have known something was wrong. Like any of us could have predicted our doctors were conducting illegal experiments. We decided right there at that coffee shop to form a support group. Within 2 weeks, we had 17 members, all victims of Project Insight who were trying to process what had been done to us. Caroline helped us organize the meetings and explained that our collective action would strengthen both the criminal case and the civil lawsuit. She said prosecutors loved seeing victims united because it showed a pattern of deliberate harm rather than isolated incidents. Insurance companies and juries responded differently when they saw multiple people affected the same way. The media found out about our group somehow, probably through courthouse filings or FBI sources. Suddenly, reporters were calling me constantly, wanting interviews about pharmaceutical exploitation of psychiatric patients. It became national news fast. Caroline advised me to be selective about which interviews I accepted because I was a key witness in the ongoing criminal investigation. Anything I said publicly could potentially be used by defense attorneys to challenge my testimony later. She recommended talking to one experienced journalist who understood the legal complexities and would focus on the systemic issues rather than sensationalizing personal trauma. I agreed to meet with an investigative journalist who had been covering pharmaceutical industry corruption for over a decade. Her name was Rachel, and she spent 4 hours interviewing me in Caroline's office with my lawyer present the whole time. Rachel asked tough questions but handled my story with respect. She wanted to understand the bigger picture about how companies like Viridian exploited regulatory gaps and vulnerable populations. The article she wrote focused on the broken systems that allowed this to happen, rather than just my individual experience. She interviewed other victims, medical ethics experts, and former FDA officials to build a comprehensive story about pharmaceutical industry practices. The article went viral within hours of publication. Rachel's editor promoted it heavily on social media, and suddenly everyone was talking about Project Insight. My phone exploded with notifications as the story spread across news sites and discussion forums. The comments section filled with people sharing their own experiences of feeling exploited by doctors or pharmaceutical companies. Some were probably legitimate, others maybe exaggerated, but the collective anger was real and powerful. Rachel's article prompted 24 more victims to come forward, including several from states where the FBI hadn't even known Viridian operated. The scope kept expanding as more people recognized their own experiences in the pattern we had described. Federal prosecutors led by Isaiah Howe started offering plea deals to several Viridian executives in exchange for testimony against the CEO and chief medical officer who designed Project Insight. Agent Castaneda explained that this was standard practice in complex corporate cases. They worked their way up the chain by getting lower-level people to flip on their bosses. The case was building toward a major trial that could set precedent for pharmaceutical industry accountability. Isaiah wanted to make sure the people at the top faced serious consequences, not just fines that companies could write off as business expenses. 2 months after my meeting with Dr. Ed Huffman, I had to testify before a grand jury about my experience. They met in a secure room at the federal courthouse with no cameras or public access. I walked them through the entire timeline, starting with Kelly stealing my pills and ending with Huffman's recorded confession. The prosecutors asked detailed questions about every medical appointment, every dosage change, every withdrawal symptom I experienced. It was exhausting reliving everything in such clinical detail, describing panic attacks and brain zaps to a room full of strangers who were taking notes. But I knew it was necessary to build the strongest possible case against everyone involved. The grand jury members looked increasingly disturbed as I explained how my psychiatrist had turned my mental health treatment into an unauthorized experiment, and by the end, several of them were visibly angry at what they had heard. The grand jury came back with charges 2 weeks after I finished testifying. Agent Castaneda called me personally to share the news before it went public. 7 Viridian executives got hit with conspiracy to commit fraud, unauthorized human experimentation, and reckless endangerment. The charges were serious enough that none of them would see bail. Huffman got charged separately because he'd started cooperating with prosecutors immediately after his arrest, hoping for a reduced sentence. He gave them everything he had, including detailed records of every patient he'd enrolled in Project Insight and copies of his communications with Viridian. Isaiah told me Huffman's cooperation was making the case against the executives even stronger because he could testify about exactly how they designed the program and what instructions they gave to doctors like him. 3 months after my first FBI contact, Kelly's sentencing hearing arrived. I hadn't decided whether to attend until the night before, when Caroline called and said my presence might help the judge understand the full impact of what happened. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with maybe 30 people scattered across the benches. Kelly sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked thinner than I remembered, her face drawn and tired. The prosecutor presented the cooperation agreement first, explaining how Kelly's testimony had helped identify the larger pharmaceutical conspiracy and would be crucial in the upcoming trials against Viridian executives. Because of that cooperation, they were recommending a reduced sentence from 18 months to 8 months with credit for time served. That meant she'd be out in 4 months. Kelly's lawyer stood up and talked about how his client had been manipulated by more powerful people, how she was young and desperate for money and didn't fully understand the harm she was causing. I sat in the back row listening to him paint Kelly as another victim, which wasn't entirely wrong but also wasn't the whole truth. The judge asked if any victims wanted to make statements before sentencing. I stood up before I could talk myself out of it and walked to the podium at the front of the courtroom. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper where I'd written notes the night before. I talked about the withdrawals, the panic attacks, the medical bills I was still paying off. I explained how Kelly's betrayal made me question my own sanity because she was supposed to be my friend and roommate, someone I trusted completely. But I also said that after learning about Project Insight and how Viridian had exploited her financial desperation, I understood she'd been caught in a system designed to turn vulnerable people against each other. I told the judge that Kelly made terrible choices and hurt me badly, but the people who designed that system deserved the harshest punishment. When I finished, the judge nodded and made notes on his papers. He looked at Kelly and said this case demonstrated how institutional corruption exploits everyone it touches, from patients to medical students to healthcare workers. Then he accepted the plea agreement and sentenced Kelly to 8 months with credit for time served. She'd be released in 4 months on supervised probation. Caroline filed the class action lawsuit the same week Kelly got sentenced. She'd been preparing it for months, gathering documentation from all 238 identified victims and building a comprehensive case against Viridian Therapeutics. The lawsuit alleged fraud, negligence, battery, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. When the filing became public, Viridian's stock price dropped 40% in a single day. News outlets picked up the story, and suddenly Project Insight was front-page news across the country. Caroline told me the company's board of directors called an emergency meeting to discuss bankruptcy as a way to limit their liability to victims. She'd anticipated that move and structured the lawsuit to pierce corporate protections and go after individual executives' personal assets if necessary. I started seeing Mia Buchanan 2 weeks after the lawsuit went public. Caroline recommended her because she specialized in medical trauma and institutional betrayal, which was apparently a whole category of psychological damage I'd never heard of before. Mia's office was in a quiet building near campus, decorated with plants and comfortable furniture that didn't look like a typical therapy office. During our first session, she asked me to describe my experience with the healthcare system before Kelly's theft and Huffman's experiment. I told her about trusting my psychiatrist completely, believing he had my best interests in mind, following his recommendations without question. She listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes. Then she explained that what I experienced wasn't just about the specific betrayals by Kelly and Huffman, but about having my trust in entire systems exploited for profit. The violation went deeper than stolen pills or experimental medication because it shattered my fundamental belief that healthcare providers were supposed to help people, not use them. Over the next several sessions, Mia helped me understand that my constant vigilance and difficulty trusting doctors was completely normal given what happened. She said my brain had learned that medical professionals could be dangerous, so it was protecting me by staying on high alert. That made sense intellectually, but it didn't make the paranoia easier to manage. She taught me specific strategies for getting necessary medical care while managing the anxiety. Always bring someone I trust to appointments. Request detailed explanations of any prescriptions, including manufacturer information, and why that specific medication was chosen. Keep my own records of symptoms and side effects. Ask questions until I felt satisfied with the answers, even if it seemed excessive. She emphasized that these weren't signs of mental illness or overreaction, but reasonable precautions after experiencing real exploitation. 6 months after Huffman's arrest, the criminal trial against Viridian executives began. The courthouse was packed with reporters, victims, and family members. Isaiah had warned me I'd be called as a witness and would spend significant time on the stand. I testified for 2 full days, walking the jury through my entire experience with the experimental medication. Isaiah asked me to describe every appointment with Huffman, every dosage change, every withdrawal symptom I experienced. I explained how I'd discovered the UV codes on my pills and what that revelation felt like, learning I'd been an unwitting test subject while struggling with depression and dealing with Kelly's theft. The defense attorneys tried to rattle me during cross-examination, asking whether I'd ever explicitly asked Huffman if I was in a clinical trial. I said no, because patients shouldn't have to ask if their doctor is secretly experimenting on them. That answer seemed to land well with the jury. The defense attorneys spent days trying to argue that none of the victims were actually harmed because the medication we received was chemically similar to approved formulas. They brought in their own expert witnesses who testified about pharmaceutical equivalents and therapeutic windows. But Isaiah was ready for that strategy. He presented my complete medical records, showing the ER visits, withdrawal symptoms, and psychological trauma directly caused by Huffman's unauthorized dosage manipulations. He highlighted the correlation between Huffman's experimental dose changes and my physical symptoms, demonstrating that the harm wasn't theoretical, but documented and severe. The defense tried to suggest my symptoms could have been caused by Kelly's theft instead, but Isaiah showed the timeline proved I experienced the worst symptoms during periods when Kelly wasn't stealing my medication, only when Huffman was adjusting my doses for the trial. Other victims testified about reactions far more severe than mine. Phoebe took the stand and described her liver damage, pulling up her shirt to show the jury her surgical scars. She was 23 years old and would need regular monitoring for the rest of her life, because Viridian wanted data on higher dosages without proper safety protocols. Another victim, a college student like me, testified about his suicide attempt during a withdrawal period when his medication was secretly switched. He'd survived, but the trauma of that experience combined with learning it was deliberately caused had left him barely able to function. His mother sat in the front row crying as he described finding out that his suffering had been intentional, designed to generate data for a pharmaceutical company's profit. The jury members looked increasingly disturbed as victim after victim described similar patterns of exploitation. Several jurors were visibly emotional by the end of the testimony phase. Then Chase Garza took the stand. He'd worked in Viridian's research division for 6 years before becoming a whistleblower. Isaiah walked him through the internal structure of Project Insight, having him explain how executives designed the program specifically to avoid FDA oversight and safety requirements. Chase testified that executives knew patients were being harmed, but continued the program because the data was valuable for future FDA applications. He provided internal emails where executives joked about psychiatric patients being unreliable witnesses if problems arose. One email from the CEO said they should focus on patients with depression and anxiety, because those conditions would provide cover if anyone reported adverse effects. Another executive had written that the beauty of the program was that even if patients suspected something was wrong, their own doctors would dismiss their concerns as symptoms of mental illness. The jury looked furious as Isaiah displayed these emails on screens around the courtroom. Chase's voice shook as he read them aloud, explaining that he'd participated in meetings where these strategies were discussed openly, and his guilt over staying silent for so long was why he'd finally come forward. The jury got the case on a Tuesday afternoon and we all went home to wait. 3 days felt like 3 years. I kept checking my phone every 5 minutes like the court clerk would text me the verdict. Caroline called Wednesday night to say deliberations going long was actually good news because it meant they were taking it seriously and reviewing all the evidence carefully. Thursday morning, I couldn't eat breakfast. Thursday afternoon, I walked around campus in circles until my feet hurt. Thursday evening, Caroline called and said the jury requested to review the internal emails again, the ones where executives joked about psychiatric patients being unreliable witnesses. Friday morning at 10 a.m., my phone rang. Caroline said the jury had reached a verdict and we needed to get to the courthouse immediately. I drove there shaking so hard I almost ran a red light. The courthouse parking lot was packed with news vans and reporters. Inside, the courtroom filled up fast with victims and their families. Phoebe sat 2 rows ahead of me with her mother. The college student who attempted suicide was there with his therapist. I counted at least 40 people I recognized from our support group meetings. The jury filed in, and none of them looked at the defense table. Caroline squeezed my hand and whispered that was a good sign. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict, and the foreman stood up holding a piece of paper. Guilty on all charges against the CEO. Guilty on all charges against the chief medical officer. Guilty, guilty, guilty down the list. Someone behind me started crying. Then someone else. Then half the courtroom was crying, including me. The CEO sat there staring straight ahead like he couldn't believe this was happening to him. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, but he shook it off. The judge thanked the jury and set sentencing for 2 weeks out. We all filed out of the courtroom and reporters swarmed us on the courthouse steps. Isaiah gave a statement about justice being served and pharmaceutical companies being held accountable. I didn't talk to any reporters. I just wanted to go home and process what had actually happened. Sentencing day came faster than I expected. The courtroom was even more packed this time. The judge let victims give impact statements if they wanted. Phoebe went first and talked about her liver damage and how she'd never trust a doctor again without questioning everything. The suicide attempt survivor talked about the nightmares he still had. I didn't give a statement because I'd already said everything I needed to say during the trial. The judge sentenced the CEO to 12 years in federal prison. 12 years. The chief medical officer got 10 years. The other executives got between 3 and 7 years depending on their involvement. All of them had to pay money back to victims. The CEO's wife started crying when the judge read his sentence. His lawyer immediately said they'd appeal. But Caroline told me appeals almost never work in cases with this much evidence. Walking out of that courthouse felt different from after the verdict. This time it was really over. The criminal part anyway. Caroline had been working on the civil lawsuit the whole time, and 3 days after sentencing, Viridian Therapeutics declared bankruptcy just like she predicted. but she'd already gotten the bankruptcy court to approve victim claims as top priority. The settlement fund was $47 million split between 238 victims. My share came out to $198,000. Caroline's office sent me the paperwork, and I stared at the number for a long time. It covered every single medical bill from the experimental medication. It covered the ER visits and the therapy and the time I missed from work. It gave me enough money to finish college without loans and keep seeing Mia twice a week for as long as I needed. But it didn't undo what happened. It didn't give me back the version of myself who trusted doctors and took medication without counting pills obsessively. I put most of the money in savings and used some to pay off my car. Bought my elderly roommate a really nice birthday present because she'd been so patient with me during the trial. Set up automatic payments to Mia's office so I wouldn't have an excuse to skip therapy. Life got quieter after that. I focused on finishing my degree and trying to feel normal again. Then 6 months after sentencing, Caroline called and said Kelly had been released from prison and wanted to meet with me. My first reaction was absolutely not. But Caroline said Kelly had been asking for weeks and seemed genuinely different. I thought about it for 7 days before telling Caroline okay, but only with her present and only in a public place. We met at a coffee shop near campus on a Saturday afternoon. Kelly walked in looking smaller and more real than I remembered. Her hair was shorter and she wasn't wearing makeup. She worked as a medical billing clerk now because nursing was gone forever. She sat down across from me and Caroline and started talking about patient advocacy groups she volunteered with on weekends. Kelly said she spent her time in prison reading everything she could about medical ethics and informed consent. She'd written letters to dozens of victims apologizing. She testified at 3 other trials involving similar pharmaceutical schemes. She worked with state legislators on bills to protect patients from exploitation. She said she knew nothing she did would ever make up for what she'd done, but she had to try anyway. I listened to her talk about dedicating her life to helping other victims and working to change the system. Part of me wanted to stay angry forever. But sitting there watching her explain how she volunteered 20 hours a week helping people navigate medical billing disputes and insurance denials, I realized we'd both been caught in something bigger than either of us. She made terrible choices and hurt people, including me. But the pharmaceutical company and Huffman had used her desperation and lack of training to turn her into an accomplice. I left that meeting feeling something close to closure. Not forgiveness, exactly. I'd probably never fully forgive her for selling my sanity for beer money and joking about psychiatric patients while stealing our medications. But I understood that we were both victims of a system designed to exploit vulnerable people for profit. She was trying to make amends in real ways that helped other people avoid what happened to us. I'm finishing my degree now, 3 semesters left. I see Mia every week, and we work on managing the paranoia that never completely went away. I found a new psychiatrist who lets me record our appointments and explains everything in detail before prescribing anything. I still count my pills every single day and probably always will. I used part of my settlement money to start a scholarship for students studying medical ethics. The application asks them to write about informed consent and why vulnerable patients deserve protection. Life isn't perfect, and I'm not the same person I was before Kelly stole my first pill. Some violations change you permanently in ways that don't heal completely. But I turned that change into something useful. I advocate for informed consent protections at the state level. I help other pharmaceutical trial victims navigate the legal system and connect with resources. I speak at medical school ethics classes about what happens when doctors prioritize research over patient welfare. The paranoia and hypervigilance became tools for protecting other people from what happened to me. I built a support system of people who understand that healing doesn't mean forgetting what was done to you, or pretending you're the same person you were before someone decided your life was worth less than their career advancement and a pharmaceutical company's profit margin. Well, that's another beautifully messy ending. If you made it this far, you clearly enjoy emotional damage with a side of laughter. Subscribe, and let's keep making bad decisions together.